How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good afternoon. The first item of business is Scottish Parliament Corporate Body Questions. Before I start, can I say that questions 2 and 5, 3, 9, 10 and 11 are grouped together. Question 1, Jeremy Balfour.
Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body, what its position is on facilitating the Eden Project initiative for Big Lunch in June 2020 to bring people together who work at the Parliament together and help strengthen the sense of community.
Ruth Davison.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank the member for that question. The Big Lunch looks like a really worthwhile event with a strong message of community engagement, and I know all members and the SPCB would want to be supportive of such an initiative. As the member will be aware, we have supported a similar event, the Great Get Together, as part of the Joe Cox Foundation in recent years, and as such, I would suggest that the Eden Project makes contact with the Scottish Parliament's Events and Exhibitions team to discuss this event in more detail so it can be considered along with other events like the Great Get Together.
Jeremy Balfour.
Can I thank the member for that positive answer? I wonder if you would also consider other community initiatives on the back of a Big Lunch, such as regular exercises or healthy workshops to give all MSPs and parliamentary staff the opportunity to socialise and improve their mental and physical health well-being during the work break times.
These are exactly the sorts of positive suggestions that the SPCB would consider in future, and indeed our events team is designed to help members facilitate, and outside organisations, facilitate such events in future.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Given the current situation around the coronavirus and in the context of this question, the Eden Project initiative and the promotion of other large gatherings of people, What immediate and practical steps will be taken to safeguard building users, for example, a disabling of the fingerprint entry system, and what further steps will be taken should the virus move beyond the containment phase?
Ruth Davison.
Thank you. Officials have been monitoring the spread of the coronavirus over recent weeks and recognise that if a number of cases increases, it may have significant impact on all of us, whether we work at Holyrood or at a local office, or whether we're a visitor to this place. At our meeting this morning, the corporate body discussed our approach to pandemic planning and considered the options open to us in limiting exposure to the virus. The corporate body is mindful of its duties to and responsibilities to its employees and those who work at the Parliament, including those under the Health and Safety at Work Act. At present, our focus is promoting hand and respiratory hygiene as the main measures in preventing the spread of the virus, and hand sanitizer dispensers have now been placed around the building to help with that. As to the two-factor identification system, while we take steps to mitigate the impact of the coronavirus, it is important that we remain vigilant and not introduce vulnerabilities into our agreed approach to security. The readers used at the entrances carry no more risk of cross-contamination than a door handle, so two-factor authentication will not be suspended. For those with concerns about cross-contamination, hand sanitizer is available at each of the main entrances. On large gatherings, other legislatures, such as the European Parliament, have chosen to stop their engagement activities, and to limit exposure to those that normally work in Holyrood, we may choose to do the same if circumstances warrant that. The corporate body recognises that this would only be done in the most extreme circumstances and would be informed by advice from officials such as the Chief Medical Officer.
Elaine Smith, briefly, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would the SPCB publish detailed guidance, and could we have some more attention to fighting the spread of infection? For example, putting paper towels back into toilets, replenishing soaps quickly, supplying wipes for keyboards, and also situating the hand gels at the public entrance and in the MSP block. And on the issue of fingerprinting, I would like to ask the SPCB to look at that again in terms of infection.
Ruth Davison.
Okay. To reassure the member, the SPCB will continue to monitor the situation in accordance with the teams that we have and the engagement activity that we're doing with other official bodies, including other UK legislatures and the Scottish Government's Resilience Room. In terms of communication with members, we have already communicated on the outbreak, and we will continue to do so regularly as the situation develops. Officials are creating an FAQ sheet on how public health advice can be followed, and the aim is to have this advice as applicable to members and their staff as to staff and contractors in Holyrood. We recognise that mitigation steps may need to be increased in the future as risks change or emerge, and if required, we will take steps that are in line with the advice from public health agencies. On the specific issues she raises of hand sanitizer at the public entrance, of replacing paper towels, etc., we did have a discussion this morning regarding the work that cleaning crews do, how we can increase what they do as the situation merits it. We will continue to take advice from public health bodies on that.
Question 2, Mary Fee.
To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what assessment has been made of the level of threat to IT systems from international cyber-attacks.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body fully recognises that the importance of cyber resilience for all organisations has never been greater. Digital technologies are vital to the successful operation of all modern organisations, and the corporate body have put in place a variety of tools, technologies and procedures to protect the Parliament from a successful attack. Our critical cyber security controls regularly undergo an independent assessment of their effectiveness, earning the Scottish Parliament Cyber Essentials Plus certification, which is revalidated annually. In addition to the technical measures and controls in place, the Scottish Parliament is a member of the Cyber Security Information Sharing Partnership and is in regular contact with the National Cyber Security Centre and other bodies who provide advice on the current threat landscape and cyber security best practice.
Mary Fee.
I'm grateful to Mr Stewart for that very detailed answer. How does the corporate body stay appraised of current cyber security developments?
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body stays appraised of current cybersecurity developments, working with the NCSC and Scottish Government in this regard. We regularly update our technical safeguards for balancing ease of use with security. As mentioned, the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body has recently undertaken an independent assessment of critical cybersecurity controls, leading to the award of Cyber Essentials Plus certification once again.
Question 5, James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Corporate Body what recent evidence has been received that its IT systems have been subject to cyber attacks from international sources.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body have monitoring systems designed to provide early warning of cyber attacks and their origins. While significant target cyber attacks against the Scottish Parliament are relatively rare, we encounter periodic, smaller-scale attacks. No attacks so far are known to have been successful. The distributed nature of the internet is such that it's not always possible to attribute attacks to particular nation-states, but the origin of some of these attacks is known to be outside the UK. Of course, as network users, we all can share a responsibility to protect the security and cybersecurity of the Scottish Parliament.
James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I thank Mr Stewart for the answer. Can I ask if the security budget, the Scottish Corporate Body security budget, is adequate in order to protect systems from these attacks, and whether it has been increased in order to ensure that we keep up to date with IT security developments?
David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, I first of all acknowledge Mr Kelly's expertise in this particular area. The corporate body ensures that the level of protection offered to systems meets or exceeds the baseline standards outlined in the Public Sector Action Plan on Cyber Resilience. The action plan was developed by the National Cyber Resilience Leaders Board and the National Cyber Security Centre, and aims to ensure that Scotland's public bodies have in place a common baseline of good cyber resilience practice, and obviously budgets follow that, Mr Kelly. Our efforts in this area are independently assessed by the Cyber Essentials Plus certification process. The corporate body also recognises that cybersecurity measures must continue to evolve as new threats emerge. As such, there are organisational procedures in place to ensure that we are kept aware of emerging threats and continue to update our systems while balancing the security of our systems with the flexibility that allows members and their staff to work anytime from anywhere. If members such as Mr Kelly have any specific concerns, including the budget, I'm very happy for our cybersecurity expert to meet Mr Kelly and have a more in-depth discussion.
Question 3, Alec Neil.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body when it will make a decision regarding the level of MSP allowances for staff for 2020-21?
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. And with your indulgence, I'll maybe take a little time in responding to this question in the hope of helping with Mr Neil's question, but those that have been lodged by others. The corporate body met this morning as planned. Amongst other issues, we discussed the annual operating of the staff cost provision. I can announce that with effect from 1st April, the provision will be operated by 2.96%. There is an important distinction between MSPs and the SPCB when it comes to employment matters. It is the corporate body's responsibility, under the terms of the members' expenses scheme, to operate the staff cost provision, which members then use to employ and pay their staff. The SPCB is not the employer in this relationship, and it is for individual MSPs to budget for their staff salary and cost of living award. The SPCB must update the scheme by the 1st of April each year, having regard to such indices as they consider appropriate. Members will be aware that we have previously used ASH, which is the Index of Annual Survey of Hours and Earnings and is retrospectively based on public sector workers' pay in Scotland. However, members might also be aware that this annual index is showing as 1.4%, which is below the current rate of inflation and what we might expect by way of growth for public sector wages in Scotland. This morning, we agreed that a more appropriate mechanism for this coming year and going forward would be to use the average of ASH and average weekly earnings indices. Both these indices are wage-related and taken together will better reflect wider pay conditions in the public sector. The corporate body agreed that this combined use of indices, which results in a 2.96% uplift to the staff cost provision, was both fair and affordable. I would also like to move on to the wider issue of the overall staff cost provision. The corporate body noted with interest the increase announced yesterday by IPSA, uplifting the staff cost provision for members of the House of Commons by £21,000 per member. At the start of this session, the SPCB increased the overall staff cost provision by £30,000 per member in recognition of the increased powers of this Parliament. As members will be aware, as a matter of good practice, the corporate body has been reviewing the provisions in the current members' expenses scheme ahead of the next session. As part of this review, the SPCB is committed to reviewing the overall staff cost provision. It will do so in the current session with a view to implementing any changes at the start of session 6. And I apologise for the slightly more involved response, but hope that the additional detail and context have been helpful both to Mr Neil but other colleagues who understandably have an interest in this issue. Thank you.
Yes, and I hope we can have short supplementaries after this, after that full statement. Mr Neil.
Presiding officer, can I draw the corporate body's attention to the fact that our staff are the worst paid staff and the allowances are the worst of any parliament in the United Kingdom. The 13.9% increase at Westminster now means there's a huge differential between what MPs get and what MSPs get. We owe it to our staff to look after them and make sure they get fair treatment. The Westminster rise is based on what other people get in similar jobs throughout the United Kingdom. Can I ask the corporate body to fundamentally review the situation, because it's unacceptable that our staff continue to be so badly paid compared to other staff doing equivalent jobs in the rest of the country.
Liam MacArthur.
Can I thank Alex Neil for his supplementary, and certainly in terms of the sentiment he expresses, I don't think I would at all distance myself from that. It's why at the start of this session, as I said, there was an attempt to uplift the amount available through the staff cost provision to reflect the additional workload on members, but also on their staff. It is a process that we are going through at the moment with a view to putting in place, I think, a system at the start of session 6 which again should reflect the additional workload and the expectations that, as Mr Neil rightly says, we place upon our staff, and we owe a duty of care to them in that regard.
Question 9, Jackie Bailey.
Can I associate myself with Alex Neil's remarks and say that I'm delighted that the corporate body have recognised the unfairness of differential pay rises for staff in the Parliament for this year and welcome the pay up rating of 2.96%. Can I also thank the GMB for their intervention?
No, I'm afraid you have to ask a question.
I'm just about to.
No, you should be asking the question.
In terms of the future review, will the corporate body...
No, the question as is on the paper, please.
Oh. I thought you were dispensing with that when you grouped them.
No.
Oh, fine, OK. Just waste more time.
There's a chatty way to address me. I don't know if I quite
fine.
approve
to
of
ask
it.
The Scottish
Ms
Parliament...
Bailey, start again. We'll wipe the slate clean. Begin.
To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body whether it will uprate member staff cost provision in line with the Scottish Government uprating of 3%.
Briefly, Mr MacArthur.
I don't think there's much I can add to what I've already said in relation to the initial response.
Ms Bailey, your supplementary.
Thank you. I was simply trying to save you time, presiding officer, but there you go. Can I thank the GMB for their intervention? And in terms of the future review, will the corporate body ensure there is a comparison with the Welsh Assembly where there is a larger budget for staff despite having fewer powers?
Liam MacArthur.
I think the point that both Mr Neil and Ms Bailey have made in terms of comparisons with other legislatures is one that certainly informs the discussions and the decisions the corporate body takes. I would say that there are differences in terms of the arrangements across the expenses scheme with the Welsh Assembly and what we have here in the Scottish Parliament, but it will certainly feature prominently in the deliberations we have in the run-up to the start of the next session.
Question 10, Bob Doris.
To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body what steps it is taking to ensure that members can appropriately remunerate their staff.
Liam MacArthur.
Again, I'm not sure there's much I can add to the earlier response.
Bob Doris.
Well, can I put on record, presiding officer, that I will have to restructure my office and lose headcount. That means a member of staff if I am to appropriately pay my staff what they deserve. And on that basis, will the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body consider a step change and substantially increase staffing budgets in this place, perhaps in line with Westminster, before they decide on any future annual increases in the first place?
Liam MacArthur.
I think, as I said in my earlier response, ultimately the corporate body has a responsibility in terms of operating the staff cost provision and office cost provision in line with indices. It's for individual members to take decisions around the employment of staff, the terms that they are on. So I think in terms of the specific circumstances in Bob Doris's office, I would encourage him to engage in discussions with the HR colleagues if there are specific issues that they may be able to help them with.
Question 11, Daniel Johnson.
To ask the Scottish Parliament Corporate Body what discussions it has had regarding the increase in MSP staffing budget.
Liam MacArthur.
Again, nothing much more to add to the initial response.
Daniel Johnson.
Associate myself with the previous colleagues' comments. I think the 2.96% increase is of course welcome, but the means by which we have arrived at it is not. Distinctly lacking is a voice of trade unions and staff themselves. Will the corporate body look at having better union and staff representation in future talks and future examination of pay structures in the Parliament?
Liam MacArthur.
I think, as I said earlier, the SPCB is responsible for operating staff cost provision in line with indices. As I say, we've described the process we went through in setting ASH as an indices. We've moved to one where ASH, AWE, a basket of those indices, is the measure by which future staff cost provision will be uprated. It's for individual members of Parliament to make their own arrangements in terms of the employment of staff.
Daniel, I think that's like Patrick Harvey, I beg your pardon. Briefly, please, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I echo the general sentiment of the Chamber on this, but I'm also concerned that over the coming weeks and months, we may find that many MSPs staff have to go through sick leave or perhaps be in isolation. Can the corporate body assure us that the staff cost provision will be flexible enough to ensure that none of us are in the position of having our staff have to lose pay in order to do that, or have our offices cease to function? And will the same principle apply to corporate body staff and contractor staff as well?
Liam MacArthur.
I thank Patrick Harvey for raising that issue, which did come up during the discussions this morning. I can assure him that this is very much part of the live consideration of what is an evolving situation, but I think we're very cognizant of the fact that either individual members through their own staffing arrangements or indeed other building users may be affected over the coming weeks and months, and we need to be responsive to that, so we will be.
Question for Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body what equality monitoring of staff employed by MSPs it undertakes and what steps it's taking to address any underrepresentation from any section of society.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The corporate body does not undertake equality monitoring on behalf of members, as each member is an employer in their own right. The responsibility lies with them to gather data on equalities information on their staff. The SPCB, however, does provide advice and guidance to members to assist them to monitor the diversity of staff within their respective offices. All staff also have the option to add their personal equalities information into the electronic HR system. This is the same management information system that is used for holding their payslips and other personal data. The member can access this information if requested through the Human Resources Office, who can provide a breakdown of the information. This could help the member to review the diversity in their offices if there are any barriers for staff or whether there are groups that are underrepresented.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. MSP staff, especially those working in local offices, are ambassadors for this Parliament, and in many cases they'll be the only point of contact some members of the public will have with the Parliament. So as such, it's vital that MSP staff are representative of the public that we seek to serve. But I think for this to happen, a targeted recruitment and delivery plan similar to the SPCB's own 2021 plan is required. So I wonder if the SPCB can look further into this issue and publicise the fact that they give advice and guidance on monitoring and good practice for equality issues.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, I think it's important not just that the advice and guidance exists, but that members know about it. I think it's also important to say that HR is available to provide that support and guidance to members on promoting best practice and of being an inclusive employer, and that includes providing advice and assistance to members on the recruitment of their staff, including drafting job descriptions and vacancy adverts and placing recruitment adverts to attract candidates from those sorts of diverse backgrounds. There is, I'm told, a range of fact sheets and guidance available to members on their responsibilities under the Equality Act, but I am aware that these have not been updated for some time, and hence they are currently under review. So yes, I absolutely take on board from the member that there is work to do in this area, but hopefully that work is being carried out.
Thank you. That concludes questions to the corporate body. I apologise to the four members. I think they'll understand why we had a more extensive list of questions on certain items, and we'll have a pause for a few moments to allow the front benches to take their places. Thank you. I want to move on. The next item of business is finance, portfolio questions. Question 1 has been withdrawn. Question 2, Maurice Golden, please.
To ask the Scottish Government what consideration it is giving to varying landfill tax rates and bans during the extended period before a biodegradable municipal waste to landfill ban.
Minister Ben McPherson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Rates and bans for Scottish landfill tax are intended to support a more circular economy and the delivery of our ambitious targets to reduce waste, increase recycling and cut waste going to landfill. As confirmed in the Scottish Budget, work is currently underway to explore the role that Scottish landfill tax could play in encouraging a further shift away from the landfilling of biodegradable municipal waste. A further announcement will be made when this work is complete.
Maurice Golden.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can the Minister confirm that the woeful record of failure by this Government in meeting waste targets leading to artificially high landfill tax revenues is more a muddle than a fiddle?
Minister.
As I've said, work is underway to explore any further changes in landfill tax. However, in general, we expect local authorities to discharge their statutory obligations using their existing funding. And in the case of transition to the ban on biodegradable municipal waste to landfill, there are no plans to review or change that arrangement as things stand. But as I said in my original answer, a further announcement will be made in terms of what is in the budget, in terms of exploring the role that Scottish landfill tax could play in encouraging a further shift away from the landfilling of biodegradable municipal waste.
Emma Harper.
Landfill tax is one of the many important tools which can be used to incentivise a reduction in waste. Can the Minister outline additional measures in the Scottish Budget that will support a reduction in waste and an increase in recycling?
Minister.
As part of our response to the global climate emergency, the Scottish Budget will continue to support the transition to a circular economy, as I said, cutting waste and carbon emissions and opening up economic opportunities. This includes the development of a deposit return scheme for single-use drinks containers that will reduce litter and make high-quality recycled materials available to the Scottish economy, as well as activity to support innovation in reducing waste and developing the circular economy through the Circular Economy Investment Fund. And we are also, of course, committed to introducing a circular economy bill during this parliamentary session.
Question 3, Donald Cameron.
To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to utilise the Scotland Reserve in its 2020-21 budget.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
For 2020-21, we anticipate utilising £168 million in total from the Scotland Reserve, and that comprises of £30 million of resource, £5 million of capital and £32 million of financial transactions from the existing reserve balance, and £101 million of resource underspend from 1920. So that total compares with £143 million originally stated in the Scottish Budget 2020-21 document, with a change due to an additional £25 million resource underspend this year following updated forecasts. Therefore, there is no change to the forecast balance at the end of 2020-21.
Donald Cameron.
Thank you. In this week's Finance Committee, the Cabinet Secretary said that, and I quote, we should add to the reserve in order to increase the government's ability to manage the inherent volatility under the fiscal framework. Given that the Scottish Government faces a black hole of over £500 million in next year's budget, How does she intend to build up the Scotland Reserve further?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the member knows, the resource, capital and financial transactions underspends every financial year since 2017-2018 have been deposited in the reserve, and it's quite right that we build up the reserve. But the fact of the matter is that the fiscal framework is insufficient to allow the Scottish Government to manage the volatility and the uncertainty that's inherent in our financial position in terms of meeting some of the forecast error challenges, which, it's worth remembering, is about Westminster clawing back resource because of forecast error.
Kenneth Gibson, briefly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. After the delay to this year's UK budget, it's clear that more flexibility is needed when setting Scotland's budget. Can the Cabinet Secretary please advise the Chamber what engagement the Scottish Government has had with the UK Government regarding increasing the limits on borrowing and Scotland Reserve powers, given the likely post-Brexit economic turbulence we are going to face in the coming years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member is quite right in highlighting that, and we've been seeking immediate changes to our borrowing and reserve limits given the volatility inherent in the fiscal framework. My predecessor wrote to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury in September 2019 requesting an increase to those limits. We've yet to receive a formal response to that request, but we continue to discuss this matter at ministerial level, and as recently as last week I raised the matter in an introductory call with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and I'll follow that up in our bilateral meeting.
Question 4, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I don't want to reiterate things, but to ask the Scottish Government what engagement it has had with Treasury Ministers regarding the impact of the UK budget on Scotland's finances.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, my predecessor and I have engaged with Treasury Ministers on numerous occasions to highlight the challenges caused by a late UK budget, challenges that were recognised on a cross-party basis. Despite that, the UK budget will not take place until the 11th of March, and I have received no indication of its likely content. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury has agreed to attend a meeting of finance ministers from the UK Government and devolved administrations on the 10th of March, but has noted that the information he can share on the UK budget will be constrained by market sensitivities.
Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much for that reply. With Barnett consequentials having to be estimated on commitments made during the 2019 general election, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that this unnecessary delay has shown a complete disregard for Scotland's budget process?
Cabinet Secretary.
Indeed, I do. It's not just a complete disregard for this government, but it's a complete disregard for the Scottish communities and businesses who rely on the certainty that comes with the information in the budget. In order to combat that, we have presented the budget on the basis of the best available information, including provisional block grant adjustments and the Conservative Party manifesto from last year. But that does increase the financial risk around the budget and the risk of larger fiscal framework reconciliations in later years. The lack of engagement by the UK Government, I believe, does illustrate a complete disregard for devolution and the interests of the Scottish communities.
Rhoda Grant, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Can I ask if there is additional consequentials from the UK budget? Will the Cabinet Secretary speak to other parties, have a consultation with them and indeed the whole Parliament before bringing spending proposals back to this chamber?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member will know that in terms of any changes to our budget in year, those are taken through the Finance Committee, and there's scrutiny in that process at the autumn budget revision and the spring budget revision. And subject to the level of difference when the UK Government announces its own budget next week, we would intend to honour that process as we've done every year.
Patrick Harvey.
Looking ahead, has the new Chancellor given any indication to the Scottish Government that this cart before horse approach will not be taken again in subsequent years? And does the Cabinet Secretary think that there is, at an official level in Whitehall, an understanding of the catastrophically chaotic impact of the delay that they've imposed on us this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
I am not particularly optimistic that that has been recognised, and at the quadrilateral next week I intend, along with the other devolved governments, on making the case at how much volatility and uncertainty a delayed UK Government budget has introduced. This is about taxpayers, it's about our communities, it's about our public services that need to rely on the certainty that comes through the budget. And in terms of official engagement at Treasury and our own officials, we have been repeatedly referred to the Conservative Party manifesto for the best available estimates of what we should include in terms of consequentials, which is no way of setting a budget.
5 not lodged. Question 16, Gray.
To ask the Scottish Government for what reason East Lothian Council's provisional revenue allocation per head is the 4th lowest in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the local government finance settlement is distributed in full using the needs-based formula that's discussed and agreed with COSLA. So all local authorities, including East Lothian, receive their formula share of the total funding available, which will see East Lothian Council receive an above-average increase in support for revenue services of 6.5% or £11.5 million in 2020-21. The Scottish Government is always open to suggestions to improve the funding formula, and should the member or the council wish to propose a change to the current formula, that would need to be raised with COSLA and through COSLA in the first instance.
Ian Gray.
Well, I understand that there is a formula, but the problem is that it is not working for East Lothian. The simple fact is that not enough account is being taken of East Lothian's almost unique rate of population growth. Growth fuelled by the building of over 10,000 houses required of the Council's local development plan by the Scottish Government. So will the Scottish Government not find some way to reflect this so the Council can fund the infrastructure needed for this expansion demanded by Scottish ministers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, we're supporting population growth through a whole range of different ways, including our ambitious affordable housing building programme, which sees £843 million included in this year's budget. But I repeat the point, if the member believes that there should be a change in the methodology, that would have to be agreed with all 32 different local authorities, who would all have a case to make on their unique circumstances, and therefore that should be raised with COSLA, through COSLA, and if he does that, then I'd be happy to speak to COSLA.
Question 7, Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what strategy you have in place to ensure local authorities are sufficiently funded.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government works in partnership with COSLA on behalf of all 32 local authorities to negotiate a financial settlement that ensures that local authorities can continue to provide the high-quality frontline services that the people of Scotland expect and deserve. And as I confirmed at stage 1 of the budget bill, the Scottish Government is providing local government with a substantial funding package worth in total £11.4 billion, which includes an increase to support for spending on core revenue services of £589 million or 5.8% in 2020-21.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you for that answer, but figures released by the Scottish Government last week show that local authority debt has risen by nearly 15% in just 5 years. It now sits at more than £18 billion, while Scottish councils run a deficit of £53 million, prompting COSLA to call for more funding in this year's budget. The amount of money pledged by the Scottish Government to councils this year is £6 billion less than their debt alone. With central funding is so low, how does the Scottish Government propose to help councils cut their debt without relying on further council tax increases?
Cabinet Secretary.
I tell you, the fastest way to end austerity is to ensure that austerity is ended at source, and that means ending Tory austerity. Chancellors have promised an end to austerity in 2018. They failed to deliver. Promised an end in 2019. Failed to deliver. And we'll wait and see for next week. But in terms of how local authorities use their resources, our policy is to ensure that local authorities' spending is to allow local authorities the financial freedom to operate independently. They must use their resources as efficiently as possible and deliver services effectively to ensure taxpayers get the best possible value. And in this year's budget settlement, we are ensuring that local authorities receive a total funding package of £11.4 billion to do that.
Richard Lyle.
Thank you, President Officer. Cabinet Secretary, Scotland's annual budget has fallen in real terms by 2.8% over the last decade. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that when it comes to ensuring sufficient funding for local authorities, Tory MSPs should be joining us in calling for this UK Government cut to be reversed? Tory hypocrisy is outstanding and astounding in this Parliament.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would agree with Richard Lyle that I would call on all parties in the Parliament, including the Scottish Conservatives, to call for an end of UK austerity, and any influence that they might have on their colleagues in London to ensure that the UK budget next week delivers for Scotland would be welcome. Ensuring that they deliver on their manifesto promises would be a good start.
Question 8, David Torrance.
To ask the Scottish Government what measures in the draft budget aim to boost economic growth, improve productivity and support improvements in innovation.
Minister.
The Scottish Budget includes a range of measures that will foster inclusive economic growth, raise productivity and improve innovation. For example, we have pledged £201 million worth of funding for city, region and growth deals during 2020-21. There will be £220 million of fresh seed funding for the Scottish National Investment Bank, contributing to our commitment to invest £2 billion over 10 years. And the National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland will receive £26.5 million worth of funding.
David Torrance.
I thank the Minister for that answer. The Minister will be aware that Fife Energy Park, my constituency, supports the renewable sector. Can the Minister confirm how much investment is being made in hydrogen technology as an alternative source of fuel?
Minister.
We are currently undertaking a wide-ranging assessment of hydrogen, its various applications and how it may contribute to achieving our ambitious target of net zero emissions by 2045, and also how it can provide social and economic value for the country. Informed by the outcomes of this assessment and other companion pieces of work, we will publish a Scottish Government Hydrogen Action Plan in 2020. The potential contribution of hydrogen in Scotland's transition to a low-carbon economy was further recognised in the recent Scottish Budget, which committed £10 million for hydrogen for heat demonstration projects.
Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Scottish Government how it measures the return on its support for innovation centres, and if those centres which offer exceptional returns, such as the Data Lab, will receive additional support?
Minister.
We recognised in the Scottish Budget that innovation improves productivity, competitiveness and growth, and we will therefore continue to support business investment in research and development with a target doubling of spending of £870 million. That happened in 2015 to £1.7 billion in 2025, meeting our commitment to increase grant support for business research and development from 22 million to 37 million per annum in 3 years, 2018 to 2021. With regard to a specific point that the member raises, I think they would perhaps be better directed to the Minister for Innovation. I would encourage him to take those points up with him directly.
Thank you. That concludes questions on finance. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is the debate on motion 2113 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Budget Scotland Bill at stage 3. Before the debate begins, I am required under standing orders to decide whether any provision of this bill relates to a protected subject matter, that is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In my view, no provision of the Budget Scotland Bill relates to a protected subject matter, therefore it does not require a supermajority at stage 3. So moving on to the debate in question, could I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Kate Forbes, to speak to and move the motion in her name?
Presiding Officer, as this is the final stage of the budget bill, I'm sure everybody is delighted to be nearing the finish line. I know that all communities will be grateful for the certainty that the budget bill gives when it passes at 5 o'clock today, subject to Parliament's agreement. I'd like to thank all subject committees and political parties for their deliberations on the budget. I fully appreciate that the challenge that was faced in ensuring appropriate scrutiny within a shortened budget process meant that everybody had to participate slightly differently, and I recognise the value that they have all added to the process. In particular, I'd like to thank the Finance and Constitution Committee for their carefully considered report on the budget, to which I responded on Tuesday, and for their recognition that the Scottish Budget is managing significant uncertainty, and the fiscal framework presents challenges for the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament. I agree, and that is why I'm continuing to press the UK Government for urgent change to give this Parliament the fiscal firepower it needs to meet the challenges we face, not least the economic fallout of Brexit. Presiding Officer, this is a budget that delivers for all of Scotland. It delivers stability and certainty. It delivers investment in our economy and our public services and tackling child poverty. And it delivers on our commitments to respond to the global climate emergency. All of this contributes to our collective well-being, guided by the National Performance Framework. It recognises that for Scotland to become a more successful country with opportunities for all to flourish, we must make progress on delivering our national outcomes, our economic outcomes, our social outcomes and our environmental outcomes. Taking a well-being approach means prioritising investment for the greatest impact on improving lives across Scotland now and creating the conditions to ensure well-being for future generations. Crucially, that includes addressing deep-seated inequalities. What we choose to measure really matters because it drives political focus and public activity. We need to look beyond narrow GDP measures if we want an inclusive society and a sustainable future. Economic growth will remain an important objective of this government, but to build the kind of country that we want, that growth must be sustainable and its benefits must be widely shared. As we look ahead to the challenges of the climate emergency, increasing automation and an ageing population, the argument for a broader definition of what it means to be successful as a country becomes more compelling. And that is why in 2018, the Scottish Government took the initiative to establish a new network called the Wellbeing Economy Governments Group, bringing together as founding members Scotland, Iceland and New Zealand. Its purpose is to assemble like-minded countries to challenge that narrow focus on GDP and shaping a vision for enhancing well-being through our approach to the economy. Presiding Officer, the circumstances of this budget have been challenging, and it's important that we all recognise the risks created by the UK Government and its delayed spending plans. Members will be well aware that we faced an unprecedented context for this Scottish budget, with significant uncertainty caused by the UK Government's decision not to hold its budget until the 11th of March. The context for next week's UK budget is, of course, now also being influenced by the response to coronavirus. Whilst our most immediate concern will always be the direct risk to people's health, the economic and fiscal impacts will be important factors over the year ahead for our public services, our economic output and public spending. The Cabinet Secretary for Health provided a substantive update to Parliament on Tuesday, and there is constructive engagement with the UK Government and other devolved administrations to support an effective overall response. For my own part, I am engaging constructively with UK and devolved finance ministers on the fiscal and the budgetary implications. I raised COVID-19 last week with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and will be discussing this again with him and my counterparts from Wales and Northern Ireland next Tuesday. We will also be working across government and with delivery partners to assess the potential cost implications within Scotland. While the Scottish budget includes significant increases in funding for health and local government and a range of support and reliefs for businesses, it will be important to keep those matters under close review. I will.
James Kelly.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking an intervention. Do you think it's a fair budget where someone earning less than the living wage will be paying above inflation 4.84% in council tax, whereas a government minister earning £90,000 and above will pay less in income tax?
Secretary.
The Labour Party used to attack the council tax freeze, and now they're accusing us of giving local authorities more freedom to determine how to raise it. I think what's fair is to ensure that local authorities are able to use those levers to determine how the resource is spent. When it comes back to this budget, I do believe it's important to keep matters related to the budget under close review, not least because we might have an update next week with the UK Government's budget, and that's to ensure that we are as well equipped as possible to respond to the potential challenges that lie ahead. Returning to our wider approach, the delayed UK budget has meant that we've had to use the Conservative General Election Manifesto as the basis for our assumptions on consequentials and use provisional block grant adjustments based primarily on economic forecasts from March 2019. This government has taken a prudent and carefully measured approach in setting the budget based on the best available information. And this government is leading action to provide certainty for local government and other vital public services. I've made a judgment call. I believe it's the right one, that it protects Scottish interests and that the range of risk factors have been carefully considered. The country needs certainty. The people of Scotland need this budget, and we must deliver for them. On reflecting on the circumstances under which we are setting this budget, I am absolutely certain of the need to bring forward early updates to the fiscal framework. Both the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Scottish Fiscal Commission have highlighted that the Scottish budget faces the prospect of significant reconciliations over coming years. It's obvious that the borrowing and reserve powers available to the Scottish Government are insufficient to manage the volatility inherent in the fiscal framework, and I am seeking immediate changes to those powers from the UK Government. Those powers must be reviewed in full as part of wider review of the fiscal framework, which is due to take place over 2021 and 2022. In that review, I'll be seeking to ensure that the fiscal framework is fair, effective and transparent in line with the Smith Commission's principles. Increased devolution in the fiscal framework have fundamentally changed the context of the Scottish budget. More than ever, we need a more strategic approach. I'm pleased to share with the Chamber that I've written to the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Scottish Fiscal Commission to announce my intention to publish the medium-term financial strategy on the 21st of May 2020. I believe that the MTFS is an integral part of an improved Scottish budget process, and it's a good example of Parliament and Government working together. Given the circumstances in which we found ourselves this year, the MTFS will be an opportunity for us to reflect on the implications of the UK budget and to take stock of the Commission's forecasts for the next 2 budget years. It will also be an opportunity to make the case for the changes that we need to the fiscal framework in order to be able to manage the new levels of risk and volatility. Presiding Officer, the passage of the Scottish budget today will provide almost £50 billion of investment in our public services and the economy to benefit the people of Scotland. In approving this year's budget, we make the investments for Scotland now and for our future. This Parliament is at its best when all parties engage constructively. The public finances and the decisions that we make on our public services deserve serious engagement, and that is why I invite all members to support this budget, and I'm proud to commend it to the Chamber.
Thank you very much. I would encourage members who wish to contribute to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Donald Cameron to open for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as the Cabinet Secretary noted, we are in the final lap of the budget process. And as we approach the culmination, I thought it would be appropriate to begin by reflecting on some of the positives of the last couple of weeks. And I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary sought to engage with all parties, including the Scottish Conservatives, in this process. I also welcome the fact that she has accepted some of our budget asks, including some additional funding for local councils and extra resource funding for our police. These are all positive developments, but I'm afraid, sadly, that is where the good news ends, because in terms of both process and substance, I would suggest this budget has been deficient. Let me consider process first, and forgive me if I dwell on this slightly longer than might be expected, but the technicalities matter here. Now, I acknowledge that the Cabinet Secretary introduced this budget in difficult circumstances, and I accept this is a draft budget and is always subject to small tweaks here and there, but that doesn't negate the lack of transparency in terms of what money was ultimately available in terms of her negotiations with other parties. And in many respects, that is simply a repeat of SNP budgets in the past. The Cabinet Secretary presented her budget and repeatedly stated that every available penny had been allocated, much like her predecessor used to do. In her statement to Parliament, she said, and I quote, "In allocating those resources, we have used every fiscal lever that we have to the fullest extent. Every penny is accounted for." In the Finance and Constitution Committee, she said, "When I say that I have deployed every penny on the face of the budget, I mean that I have deployed every penny." And again, a week later, my key line is that we have deployed every penny. Presiding Officer, in anyone's mind, that is a clear and unequivocal position. And yet, fast forward to the stage 1 debate last week, and miraculously, an extra 173 million appears from nowhere. So my question is this: how can any committee of this Parliament do its job of pre-budget scrutiny when the figures they are looking at can change at whim? Yes.
John Mason.
The member knows that the money did not appear from nowhere. He seeks to mislead the House. He had a clear chamber. He had a clear explanation from the Cabinet Secretary yesterday as to where the money came from after the stage 1 process.
Donald Cameron.
Don't accept that for 1 minute, Presiding Officer. How, for example, can the Local Government Committee do its job properly when allocations, which it must scrutinise, can change the tune of almost £100 million? And I'm not talking about the merits of this, simply the procedure by which it happens. And let me give some other examples. As has already been noted, and as was noted yesterday in the debate on the rate resolution, there is a major concern surrounding the near £1 billion budget black hole facing the Scottish Government over the next 3 years in terms of budget reconciliations. And that's not a question simply of the fiscal framework. This is an issue that has been bubbling away for some time. And as the Scottish Fiscal Commission notes in its forecast, the Scottish Government has chosen to borrow resource funding for the first time to cover the £207 million of reconciliations for this year. And that means that a future Scottish Government will be saddled with the debt and decisions of the current administration. But we also know that in next year's budget, the Scottish Government will have to find an estimated £555 million of reconciliations and a further £211 million the following year. In total, that is almost £1 billion to find, plus borrowing to be paid back. Yes.
Is the member therefore agreeing with me that the fiscal framework needs to be reviewed and early? Because ultimately this is about Westminster clawing back money because of independent forecasting errors.
Donald Cameron.
You're still borrowing the money, Cabinet Secretary. You still have to pay it back. So next year, the Cabinet Secretary may well have to deal with a far more challenging financial picture, and I would contend she'll have to commit to a more transparent and flexible approach if she is to gain the support of any party in this chamber. Now, turning to the £173 million deal with the Scottish Green Party, again, the funds for this are shrouded in mystery. We have this curious reprofiling of non-domestic rates, where with some creative accounting, we seem to be producing money from income not yet earned and shuffling that money from year to year. Now, quite apart from the very large £670 million increase over the next 3 years on hard-pressed business, it's yet another example of how the government is scrambling about to claw out extra cash. And what's even stranger about reprofiling is that the government knew about this source of cash not just 3 weeks ago when it appeared in the draft budget, but last year when Derek Mackay planned to reprofile £100 million for his budget. So my question is to the Cabinet Secretary, why can she not be open about this as a source of funds much earlier on? Sorry, I want to carry on. Further consequentials from the UK government also form a major part of the deal's funding. Now, we know that in terms of the block grant, the Scottish Government's budget from the UK is rising by more than £1.5 billion this year in real terms. That's the government's own estimate. And it's higher in real terms than it was when the SNP took over in 2007. These fiscal transfers from the UK to Scotland are worth a union dividend of nearly £2,000 for every individual in Scotland. Now, the Cabinet Secretary has said again and again there's lack of clarity, there's uncertainty from the UK government around consequentials. But how can she complain about uncertainty around consequentials, having already done a deal with the Green Party funded by additional consequentials? Presiding Officer, can I turn to some of the broader points of this budget? And at this point, can I endorse what the Cabinet Secretary said about the coronavirus and the need to keep a watching brief? These benches will certainly do what they can to assist in that. But most political parties chose to engage in the negotiations with her during this process, and we approached that in good faith with serious, reasonable requests. Now, our position on tax was debated at length yesterday, and I don't intend to repeat the points made by myself and others. But we also called for £15.4 million specifically for drug rehabilitation beds. That wasn't a figure plucked from thin air. We backed the calls from a charity organisation, Favour Scotland, who said this: if the Scottish Government are serious about tackling drug deaths, £50 million for drug rehabilitation beds is the absolute minimum we expect from this budget. And since the government came to power, the number of beds has fallen dramatically. And as everyone knows, drug deaths have increased dramatically in that time. So we remain bitterly disappointed that this specific commitment was not accepted. We also back COSLA's call for £117 million to fund the cut to capital allocation for our cash-strapped local authorities. And even after the agreed budget deal, Scotland's local authorities have stated explicitly that the agreement only makes good the underfunding of new and existing commitments and does nothing to address inflationary or demand pressures. And according to COSLA, the settlement still represents a 2% or £205 million cut in real terms in revenue funding for local government. We made reasonable demands, but instead the Cabinet Secretary chose to do a deal with the Greens. And never before in the history of this Parliament has an opposition party asked so much for its support and happily received so little in return. To sum up, Presiding Officer, we cannot support this budget. It's another pay more, get less budget. It's a budget that underfunds our public services, especially local councils, a budget that fails to tackle Scotland's drugs crisis, and most of all, Presiding Officer, it's a budget which does not meet the priorities of the people of Scotland, and I urge Parliament to vote against it later today.
Thank you very much, Mr Cameron. I call on Rhoda Grant to open for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We entered into discussions with the Scottish Government this year in hope, if not an expectation, that we could push the Government to invest in Scotland. After 13 years of mismanagement, our country and citizens desperately need real change. The money this Government has wasted on vanity projects and poor decisions could have been, had it been invested properly, would have helped build our economy. Instead, they squander the public purse and refuse to invest. They refuse to increase income tax for the wealthy while cutting services to the poor. Poverty is on the rise and it will not abate without action from this Government.
Secretary.
Member confirmed for the record that at 5 o'clock today her party will be voting against £1.4 billion to mitigate and support low-income families.
Rhoda Grant.
We will be voting against cuts of over £200 million to the public sector. That is going to damage every family and reduce more people into poverty. We cannot vote for a budget that does that. And, Presiding Officer, they boast of not increasing income tax, but yet, as James Kelly had said, they heap inflation-busting rises on the regressive council tax, a tax they promised to abolish over a decade ago, a promise they reiterated to the Greens in last year's budget negotiations, a promise for which the Greens then backed that budget. And we're still holding talks regarding replacing the council tax. Talks we agreed to take part in, again more in hope than expectation, and our fears have been confirmed. These talks are not about replacing the council tax, they're simply about tinkering with bans and revaluation. It's clearly a process of treading water to keep the Greens satisfied. Frankly, it's a waste of our time, and we need to re-evaluate whether these talks are worth proceeding with. And the Greens must see this. And yet they've fallen for the same old trick again. Only this time, with young people's free bus travel, they have sold them short. This was a ploy used when promising sustainable ferry funding for the Northern Isles, another sop to mislead parties to back the budget, promises that were frankly a waste of the very breath that was used to make them. And I know that other parties, the SNP, don't like this, but it is the truth. We asked that they provide young people under 25 with free bus travel. This policy would have helped young people become more independent while making family travel more affordable. It recognised that young people were more likely to be low paid, and this would help them get to work and gain the experience that they required to earn higher salaries. However, this would have helped us all by forming a habit for young people to use buses, and that would have been good for them and it would have been good for the planet. Instead, the Greens settled for talks about introducing free bus travel for young people 18 and under. This shortchanges young people because, on past performance, it's highly unlikely to happen. However, if it does, it will end around the time that young people can hold a driving licence, and this policy could actually have the impact of encouraging them to buy a car. This wrong-headed compromise will incentivise the very behaviour we seek to change by encouraging young people away from the car rather than towards it. We wanted fair funding for local government, but they're now facing a £205 million cut in real terms. How does this counteract dropping educational standards? How does it provide additional support for children with learning difficulties? And how does it provide care in our communities? We're keeping people well at home instead of being a prisoner in hospital to their distress and the greater cost to the public purse. This is totally irresponsible, and yet it continues. We asked for a budget that dealt with climate change, a budget that was tested against the National Performance Framework, and yet it's smoke and mirrors. The Fraser of Allender Institute said it's disappointing that the government have not done more to produce comparable numbers from previous years, as the failure to do so inhibits scrutiny of spending changes and does little to improve overall transparency. The Cabinet Secretary said this was a budget for well-being, but frankly, as with their promises, I'm not willing to take their word for it, and because through their budget document you can't track where it would improve well-being, we can't see that this is a well-being budget. However, what is clear is the cuts made in this budget to local government will damage the well-being of people who depend on those services. Our final ask was to invest further in higher education. We face a changing workplace with robotics and digitisation. Our existing workforce and young people coming into that workforce are ill-prepared, yet our education standards are falling and budgets have been cut. This does not augur well for the economy going forward. This is a timid response from a government when we need a response that prepares our workforce for the brave new world. The Cabinet Secretary referred to the fiscal framework negotiated by the SNP, and which now means that our budget is being cut by £200 million this year and will face up to a £1 billion black hole in the next 3 years. This is mismanagement on an unprecedented scale. They've wasted £198 million on delayed discharges since Jean Freeman took office. They've wasted £1.4 million on the Sick Kids Hospital every month without one child receiving care there, and on ferries. They could have replaced the whole fleet for the money they are going to squander on 2 ferries that will never sail. And they have consigned 33,000 people to the dole. Yet, this is a government that thinks that they can negotiate independence. Presiding officer,
order,
this
please.
budget
Order,
is
please.
damaging.
If someone wants to intervene, they can stand up and ask for an intervention. Otherwise, please be polite. They can stand up and ask for an intervention. Half the chamber is just making noises.
Yeah. Presiding officer, this budget is damaging, does not invest in the future of Scotland or its people, and it does not deal with mismanagement, and that's why we cannot support it.
Thank you. Can I call on Mark Ruskell to open for the Green Party?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I perhaps start my contribution by thanking Kate Forbes, whose spirit of compromise she brought to the negotiating table in her first ever budget. I think it's fair to say it rescued negotiations with the Greens this year, and I'm sure it won't be her last deal with the Greens in this Parliament either. Now, from next year, Presiding Officer, over 700,000 young people across Scotland and their families will benefit from free bus travel for under-19s. A policy so bold and transformational that opposition parties are still rubbing their eyes in disbelief. Fake news, they cried. It doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. It does exist. And let me say to Mr. Fraser, well, I'm coming to you, Mr. Fraser. You can come in, intervene on me in a minute. But even Mr. Fraser will be able to leave his beloved classic car in the driveway, quietly rusting away, while he gets a cheap family bus ticket to the next climate strike in Perth. I give way to Mr. Fraser.
Murder Fraser.
Sadly, I have to tell Mr. Russell, I think I'm probably too old to benefit from his policy. But can I ask him a serious question? Because Perth and Kinross Council, in the area that we both represent, currently spend £7 million a year on school transport, carrying pupils who live more than 3 miles away from school to school. Will they be able to save that money when his new policy is introduced?
Mark Ruskell.
Absolutely. Schools that are organising school trips, youth groups around Scotland will be able to use scheduled public transport services. They'll be able to benefit directly from this. And of course, Perth and Kinross Council is getting an additional £2.6 million as a result of the deal. That's going to ensure, Mr Fraser, that cuts that are being proposed by Perth and Kinross Council today, they can take those cuts off the table. They can reverse those cuts. I need to make some progress. Thank you, Mr Finlay. But of course, as well as benefiting Mr Fraser, this policy will tackle poverty and isolation, giving young people the mobility and freedom they need to access learning and job opportunities, not to mention the social benefits. And that's why the Poverty Alliance has warmly welcomed it, noting that affordable public transport is, in their words, essential in loosening the grip of poverty on people's lives. And it will make those school trips cheaper, widening educational opportunities. But we're also going to see busier buses too, upping the footfall, particularly in rural areas, making services more viable. This will be transformational, and it will build the case for even more public transport to be free in Scotland. Presiding officer, maybe one day we could even be as wild as Luxembourg and make all public transport free. Now, presiding officer, the Scottish Greens are, of course, the party of local government. We want strong, well-funded councils providing valuable services, fairly raising revenue locally with a wide suite of new powers. And in total, the Scottish Greens have now delivered more than £500 million for local services since the beginning of this Parliament. Across Scotland, councils are now making decisions as to where to invest these vital funds. And in Glasgow, for example, in the last week, the councils confirmed that the Green Budget deal means that the Blair Vaddock Outdoor Education Centre has been saved. They're welcoming it, presiding officer, and I hope that North Lanarkshire follows suit and also save the Kilbowie Outdoor Education Centre as well. And meanwhile, as I've already pointed out to Mr Fraser, councils have, in the process of approving damaging cuts like Fife, they now have the funding to go back and reverse those cuts. They can reverse them, presiding officer, as a result of this deal. Tory austerity may not be over, but these benches here will not rest until we've restored democratically accountable powers to councils to protect the services that we all value. Now, there's briefly, if I can get the time back.
The member will get the time back. Graham Simpson.
Thank you. Is Mark Ruskell seriously claiming that no council will have to make cuts on the back of this so-called deal?
Mark Ruskell.
I'm not claiming that. What I'm saying to you is that we have made a significant contribution. We have closed the £95 million gap identified by COSLA. But as Mr Simpson knows, in order to fix this, we need a new fiscal framework with local government. We need to restore the powers. I thought the Tory party was a party of localism. It appears that they don't want to give the powers to local councils to restore that investment in local services. Now, I'd like to move on to other areas of this deal. There's a lot to get through, presiding officer, and we need safer streets to live in. For the first time ever, Scotland's budget for cycling and walking infrastructure has reached £100 million. Cycling UK welcome that. They say it shows Scotland's ambitions to cut emissions and get more people active is not just hot air. It's action. It's real action, real investment. And if we're to reduce reliance on the private car, then we need to make rail more attractive than road. And that's why we've secured an additional £5 million funding to advance rail projects to the next stage. Vital projects such as the Milngui Line redualling and the Alloa-Dunfermline extension can now be taken to that next stage of development, reconnecting abandoned communities to the rail network and improving services beyond recognition. As part of our deal, the Scottish Government have also agreed in principle to align investment decisions with climate targets, and specifically to review controversial plans to spend £120 million on a flyover at Sheriff Hall. But this is just the start, and the Infrastructure Commission advice must be heeded. Every project that increases road capacity must be tested to destruction. There should be no public money wasted on projects that lock in congestion and climate change for generations to come, while sucking up all the available money that's there for repairing roads. Now, I'm delighted that there will also be an additional £25 million invested in making Scotland's homes more efficient. It's a win-win-win. Warmer homes are low carbon and cheap to run. And critically, the cash secured by the Scottish Greens will be given to councils to spend on low-income households that most need it. Now, there is no doubt that we need to do much more to tackle the climate emergency, deliver well-being, a strong economy, and also to end child poverty. This budget is a step in the right direction, and bodies from the Poverty Alliance to the Children and Young People's Commissioner, Friends of the Earth and WWF all agree. But every day we're in this Parliament is an opportunity to drive change for the good. There's no end point, no moment when we can say the job is done. And the Scottish Greens will vote for this budget today. We'll celebrate the wins, but we'll stay hungry for the change that is yet to come.
Thank you very much. And I call on Willie Rennie to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I suppose this budget was inevitable, as night follows day, probably as certain as Stuart Stevenson will make a speech later on about his ancestors, but it's no doubt that this was an inevitable budget. Councils were going to face cuts, they always were. That is the Scottish Government's approach to budgets for a number of years now, whilst claiming that they're... Not just now. I had hoped it was going to be Stuart Stevenson telling me about one of his ancestors, but alas, that will come later, I'm sure. Whilst the government says this is a generous deal, they're cutting £200 million from local government budgets. That is not generous. And I suppose it was inevitable that more money would be found, despite the protests from the new Finance Secretary. The government said there'd be no money available, but later on it was going to be reprofiling of the non-domestic rates pool and the emerging underspends. It was either very naive to have an approach that had no money left for flexibility to account for other parties' priorities, or it was extremely reckless indeed. And I think it was rather naive even to suggest it in the first place. And I suppose it was inevitable that the Greens would back the budget. After their fabricated jig that's been going on for a number of years now, they have inevitably been duped by promises of a review about the possibility of maybe having free transport for young people. And of course, the council tax talks, which Rhoda Grant quite rightly alluded to, the fact that we've been going on for a year now and made very little progress with no proposition forthcoming from the government whatsoever. We need real progress on this if this is not to be yet more duping of the Green Party. So I suppose this budget was inevitable, but some things have changed. Once the government used to be able to claim, they tried to claim, that they were competent on capital projects. But now they are wholly incompetent. They are mismanaging project after project after project. The EWPR, over budget. The ferries, double the cost. The farms IT system, way over budget. The Aberdeen hospitals, the latest catastrophe on the management of capital projects. This is a government that is not capable on capital projects, and that is why we should be reluctant to endorse a financial strategy from this government for the next financial year. But they've also failed on a number of different areas. On councils, which I've already mentioned, they started off this budget process not even baking into their budget the promises that they had already made on behalf of local government. These promises were imposed on local government. Some of the promises were good promises, but never should a government come forward with a proposition to make an improvement to public services unless they are prepared to fund the money in the first place. To start off with a negative on that front is wholly irresponsible. They have made promise after promise. In future, they should make funding promise after funding promise as well, rather than leaving councils to pick up the tab. But they've also failed the police too. We've heard repeatedly about leaking roofs. We've heard repeatedly about the fungus grown in police stations. We've heard repeatedly about the broken down cars. We've heard repeatedly, and the Justice Secretary should listen to this very carefully, we have heard repeatedly about the stress and the strain that our ordinary, hard-working police officers are under. Remember, 1 in 3 of them are turning up to work mentally unwell. We should be funding the police force properly rather than asking them to look after us, to keep us safe, while failing to fund them. Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Of course, the budget is providing an extra £60 million for Police Scotland. Can Willie Rennie tell us how many times he made representations to Danny Alexander, the Liberal Democrat Chancellor, who pinched £125 million of VAT from Police Scotland?
Willie Rennie.
This government got itself into a mess of its own making. This government centralised the police when it did not have to. This government ended up with a VAT bill of its own making. That is why this government cannot be trusted to manage Scotland's police. That Justice Secretary should be ashamed of himself for making that intervention. And they have failed also the islands of Orkney and Shetland. Orkney and Shetland.
Members, please, just show a little bit more respect. The noise in this chamber is just bordering on the rude rather than just political interruptions. Mr Rennie, continue, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These are important matters and they deserve to be considered incredibly carefully because this is a matter of trust for this government. And this government has failed our public servants repeatedly and they should be ashamed of themselves for doing so. And if you look at the islands of Orkney and Shetland, not just now, thank you very much, not just now. And if you look at the islands of Orkney and Shetland, they were promised 2 whole years ago that their internal ferries would be funded in full. A package of £16 million was the price. They are still £5 million short 2 years later. A promise, yet again, made by this government and not fulfilled. So on the councils, on the police and on the ferries, this government has failed. But they have also failed by keeping money back from public services. We all know there is going to be no independence referendum this year. But yet the Finance Secretary told me she is keeping money back for that possibility. Shameful. That is not something that we should be doing when our police are short of money, when we have got councils that are short of money, when we have got the ferries in the Northern Isles that are short of money. This government has got the wrong priorities, and only when they have got the right priorities will this party support its budget.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to the open part of the debate. I'm going to call Bruce Crawford to be followed by Liam Kerr. Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my contribution to this Stage 3 debate on the budget today, I'm going to try to bring at least a bit of hope as reasonable perspective to the deliberations, albeit on this occasion through SNP eyes. Let me begin by looking at the settlement for the coming financial year, with the caveat that we will not know the actual numbers until the UK Government sets its budget next week. As Spice described in their budget briefing, the total budget will grow in cash terms by 14.4% in 2021, 12.4% in real terms. But this large increase reflects the devolution of social security spending responsibility, as well as a new budget line for farm payments, which were previously part of EU income. With both these areas stripped out, the growth in the budget is 4.9% in cash terms and 3% in real terms. So yes, a 3% real terms increase, but this figure, importantly, includes both capital and resource spending. Now, while these figures tell the story for next financial year, what they do not do is reflect the longer-term picture in real terms. This picture, of course, tells a very different story, because Scotland's discretionary resource budget allocation is now 2.8%, or £850 million lower in real terms than a decade ago. Now, what that tells us is that the 2019 spending round has not ended a decade of austerity for spending on frontline services, other than providing some relief to health services. Now, I don't know how closely each member was listening to what the Finance Secretary was saying during last week's Stage 1 budget debate. I was certainly listening very carefully. And I'd like to quote from one small piece of the Finance Secretary's speech that I believe was of particular significance. On the additional funding, she said, "This is not without risk." Forced as we are to set our budget in advance of the UK Government's budget and with very little clarity on the block grant adjustments. Now, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned that risk issue again today, and I congratulate her on that candid nature of that statement. Because this budget is not without risk. And yes, it's entirely possible. It might not work out as planned. Because Kate Forbes has required to set a budget in the most unusual of circumstances. And let's remember, she's had to set a budget without a great deal of the relevant information, financial information, data and policy direction that should have been available from the UK Government. However, I think the right balance has been found between meeting the extra demands placed upon her by the opposition and budget responsibility. But make no mistake, the risk is there. Yet the opposition, apart from the Green Party, of course, would have the Cabinet Secretary increase that risk with their long list of demands for additional public spending commitments. Well, for one, I'm glad that Kate Forbes has been prudent. She's seen off these demands and not created a bigger risk to the Scottish budget. Therefore, if the Scottish Government's projections and assumptions it has necessarily had to make do not match with the decisions of the UK Government in the forthcoming budget, just let us remember it was the opposition who cried out for even more public spending. Now, of course, there are further risks which we're all going to have to grapple with in future. And looking ahead to next financial year, the Scottish Government and this Parliament, as others have said, is facing a £555 million of negative income tax reconciliation because of the way the fiscal framework works. How on earth we reach a budget agreement next year where flexibility has all but been removed because of over £500 million of reconciliations before a budget negotiation has even begun is a real challenge. So to help Parliament, its committees and the opposition to navigate these difficult waters, I'd firstly ask the Scottish Government to be as clear as possible about the scale of the challenge. Secondly, I'd ask them with clarity to set out its strategy, how it intends to tackle that challenge, to enable the parliamentary committees to subject their proposals to appropriate scrutiny. And thirdly, I'd suggest that the Scottish Government enters into discussions with the opposition at the earliest possible date in order to find an agreement on the way forward, if that is achievable. But I would also say to the opposition, they need to play their part too. They simply cannot go on asking for more and more additional public spending because it's not going to be available. I'm in my last minute and I'll do a Willie Rennie say, not at this stage, please. If more spending commitments are going to be entered into, we simply must not have a much more mature and responsible debate about where the money is coming from to fund such commitments. More, a debate about how the negative tax reconciliations are to be managed. And to do otherwise will mean we're not prepared to face the reality and more worryingly prepared to expose the Scottish Government to even greater risk than is necessary. And I commend Kate Forbes and the budget she has before the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Crawford. I call Liam Kerr to be followed by Alec Neil.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, one always tries to be scrupulously accurate in one's contributions to these debates, but I fear last week I made an error. You see, in my contribution to the Justice debate, I said that the SNP could give proper funding to the police because the block grant will grow by over £1 billion in real terms, a 2% real terms increase. But, Presiding Officer, it appears I was wrong, because in fact, compared to 2019-20, the Scottish Government's budget will increase by around £1.6 billion in real terms, all thanks to UK Government spending decisions. Now, of course, my own mea culpa may lead Kate Forbes to review her own position, because, of course, she said to Parliament on the 6th of February that every penny is accounted for. Indeed, she told Parliament no fewer than 12 times that every penny had been deployed. And even though, as Murdo Fraser pointed out at the time, very few people were entirely persuaded, she miraculously produced more than £170 million only days later. Yes, of course.
Kate Forbes. If the member is so unhappy with the spending sources, my spending sources, what would he have recommended we cut in order to support the Conservative Party's tax cuts and spending increases?
Liam Kerr.
Thank Kate Forbes for the intervention. It's a very simple answer. We would end the uncertainty, boost businesses, support workers and grow the economy. All the things the SNP have failed to do for 13 years. But still, Presiding Officer, despite maxing out the country's credit card when we are poised to receive the largest block grant in years, she would still not properly fund our public services or our cash-strapped local authorities. Yes, the block grant's going up, and it's the largest in years, so let's imagine, Presiding Officer, what she could have spent it on. Now, at stage one, I heard John Mason brazenly defy Unison and say it was perfectly legitimate to only offer £60 million to the police. This, bear in mind, is £36 million less than the £96 million Barnett consequentials coming to Scotland. I know how the Cabinet Secretary for Justice crowed last Wednesday, but that was before the Chief Constable told the Public Audit Committee the very next day that the budget figures that were announced will still leave an operating deficit within the police budget going forward for 2020-21. I think it is in the region, in revenue terms, of £36 million. Wait, £36 million? That's exactly the same amount the Finance Secretary is not passing on. But hey, spending choices. Kate Forbes could have put a mere £15.4 million of the £1.6 billion into drug rehab beds to increase the 70 there are now back to around the 350 there were when the SNP got in. That might start to make a genuine difference to the record number of drug deaths in Scotland. But she did not. She could have recognised that local authorities across Scotland will see a real terms cut of £117 million in their capital spending, leading to them having to hike council tax and still make massive cuts. But she did not. Instead, she bought off the Greens with a bus scheme, allegedly worth £15 million. But did she? Well, let's look at what was actually offered. Free bus travel for those aged 18 and under, subject to the completion of the necessary preparations, including research and due diligence. The ability to promise without promising borders on art, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, if I was back lecturing at university, I'd put this wording in the negotiating skills section in the chapter marked How to Offer the World whilst committing to absolutely nothing. And in an extraordinary irony, if we do indeed see the introduction of free bus travel for the under-19s, it appears it is going to be funded through making reductions to council budgets, which presumably has a knock-on effect on their climate change spending and an inability to repair the very roads these buses are supposed to run on. Now, at stage one last week, I was in the chamber listening as Alex Neil waxed lyrical about the bus travel promise. I intervened on him, and as he sat, he quipped, "It gets easier." Now, at the time, I assumed he was deploying his characteristic wry sarcasm as he braced himself for my inevitable, incisive and challenging intervention. But now I realise he was simply taunting the Greens. He was reflecting on how each year it gets easier for the SNP's Finance Secretary to make the green red lines vanish. And, Presiding Officer, I cannot finish without noting that business tax income will rise from £2.75 billion to £3.42 billion by 2023-24, a 25% hike in only 3 years. This will drive away growth and help Scotland's competition. Presiding Officer, to finish my theme where we started, last week Donald Cameron suggested that Kate Forbes had played the Greens like a fiddle. Again, he may wish to reflect on that. Because actually, she's not only called the tune and made them dance, but also produced a finished work that lacks dynamic quality, is full of wrong notes, and is ultimately disappointing to those forced to listen. For which reason, I shall not be supporting this budget at decision time today.
Alex Neil, followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I noticed that Liam Kerr referred in my speech last week that I waxed lyrical. I can honestly say I couldn't make the same claim about the speech that he has just made. Can I say to all the opposition parties except the Greens that we are living in very unusual circumstances because of the threat from the coronavirus that is amongst us at the moment. And therefore, in considering this budget and considering whether to vote against it, I think uniquely this year, to vote against this budget, which contains a £15 billion budget for the National Health Service next year, in the middle of what could become a pandemic, is absolutely irresponsible, and anyone who does that isn't fit to govern. And I say that to the Tory party and to the Labour Party, because, of course, as always...
Neil Findlay.
Friend Alec Neil for taking an intervention. He will know when he was in opposition that he voted against a number of budgets. He will know that in opposition at Westminster, the SNP group vote against budgets, and in local government SNP groups vote against budgets all the time. It is a nonsense to suggest that because you vote against the budget, you are voting against every element of that budget. He knows that, and everybody else knows that.
Alex Neil.
Well, first of all, I don't remember in opposition when we did that, because it's so long ago since we've been in opposition. And the second point is this: we never voted in the middle of what could become a pandemic. And the reality is, and we need to get this message across through the whole country, of the great possible threat that we face. And therefore, just supposing the opposition parties, other than the Greens, got their way tonight and we dumped this budget, what impact is that going to have on the National Health Service, on schools, on hospitals, on a whole range of public services, including the likes of the police and the prisons? We would have mayhem, and they would be responsible for bringing it about. Yeah. If ever there was an occasion where it's irresponsible to vote against the budget, it is today. And of course, this budget is actually, in the circumstances of the £1.5 billion of cuts that we have faced in the last 10 years, about which the Labour Party has said practically nothing in opposition to the Tories because of their loyalty to Better Together. It's because of that £1.5 billion that we have faced the problems that we have faced in the last 10 years. And I heard, I will in a minute, I've heard the crocodile tears from the Tory benches about what they describe as large cuts to local government. Their party has cut local government budgets in England by 40%. So don't tell us about cutting local government. We are protecting local government. Mr. Rumbles.
Mike Rumbles.
Of a giving way. I always like to listen to his speeches. They're always entertaining. But he will know, because he was in the Parliament with me at that time, when the SNP budget fell, because people felt it was right to vote against that budget, the SNP government went away, produced a better budget, and next week we all voted for it.
Alex Neil.
Exactly the same. But by that time, we already had the UK budget and knew exactly how much money we had to spend in the following year. But what we've got at Westminster is utter chaos, where we don't get to know, not even next week will we get to know after the budget. It'll probably be the end of this month before we get to know how much money we actually have to spend. And I think there is no one else in the... Well, indeed.
Murdo Fraser.
Grateful to him for giving way. Just on the point of timing, does he accept the current fiscal framework was negotiated at a time when UK budgets always took place in March, just in advance of the financial year? There's nothing therefore unusual about this. It's just that we've got used to, in the last 2 years, budgets taking place earlier in the fiscal year.
Alex Neil.
Well, it misses the point, which is why I understand that Murdo Fraser was sacked as the finance spokesman in place of Donald Cameron. One can understand Jackson Carlos' methodology. There's no doubt about that. So, getting back to my speech, presiding officer, and I don't think after any of those interventions I'll need injury time, by the way. Can I say this? This is an excellent budget from Kate Forbes. And let me explain one of the reasons why. And that is the new emphasis on increasing infrastructure expenditure in Scotland in line with the kind of percentage of GDP spent on infrastructure across the European Union, for example. And that will lead to 1.6 billion additional money by the middle of the 2020s. And can I just say to the Tories, if any one of them knew anything about economics, and they're quite rightly saying we need economic growth, the best way to achieve economic growth is by spending money on infrastructure. All the evidence shows for every 1% increase in infrastructure spending, it leads to a 1% increase in the growth rate of the economy. But for every pound cut in income tax, it's only half that impact on growth. And very often the growth is elsewhere because it leads to increased imports rather than settling the money within our own economy. So the economic illiterates arguing against this budget, the damage they would do by putting money into tax cuts for people who don't need them, rather than spending the money on growth-creating infrastructure, would be a huge mistake if we went down that road. And the Finance Secretary also referred to the issue of fiscal firepower. And I heard what she said, and I'm delighted what she said when it comes to the renegotiation of the fiscal framework. But can I also say to her...
no, Mr Neil, could you perhaps finish?
Right, my final point is to read the Smith Commission, because now that we're out of the European Union, the reason for us not having VAT control here has gone, and we should argue for that as well.
Call Claudia Beamish, to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Officer, it is disappointing that this budget will only continue cuts across hard-working local authorities, forcing them to difficult decisions and risking reduction of essential services.
Excuse me, Ms Beamish. When people are leaving the chamber, could they please do so quietly? Ms Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. With a full and fair local government settlement, we could have seen climate opportunities seized and real change for those living in the grip of poverty, which is why we will be voting against the budget today. The government seems to underestimate the impact that annual budgets will have for decades ahead, and just how vital it is that this budget is one really fit for the climate emergency. It has been Labour's ask throughout this process that the budget is fit for purpose to tackle climate change and to deliver Scotland's workers and communities a just transition. This budget should have been an end to the last decade of mismanagement, with 898.8 million lost to local authority revenue budgets by the SNP government since 2013-14. But it isn't. The next decade will not be nearly as forgiving. Let us turn the focus to local government, where there is still a cut of 205 million. COSLA states that, I quote, its ambitions to tackle climate change are at risk when core budgets are under threat, and also emphasises, again I quote, to address climate change we need fair funding for revenue and capital budgets. Local authorities are perfectly placed to act on climate change, act against fuel poverty, transport poverty and food poverty, and to tackle flooding, bringing a better quality of life for our rural and urban communities, while also creating local skilled jobs through the just transition throughout our country. Failure to take on climate change in this decade means failure to take on climate change full stop. And with the COP26 this year, we need to hold our heads up high with a climate-aligned budget. The Just Transition Commission interim report was a welcome reminder of the importance of the steps and urgency of implementation required. With more ministerial intervention and mutually reinforcing environmental and social policies, there are huge opportunities in innovation, progress and cooperation to seize. The SNP's approach has not worked, and they have failed to engage in many ways. Renewables jobs have been lost to abroad, yards left idle, and sectors like energy and agriculture are rudderless without direction. Key to a positive future for our children and grandchildren will be the development of skilled and unionised jobs in communities across Scotland. There are many examples of courses across Scotland, not least in my South Scotland region. To highlight but two, Dumfries and Galloway Council offers courses for installers to install solid biomass heat pumps and more, and Heriot-Watt University offers an MSc in marine renewable energy, importantly by distant learning. There is much to build on. The Just Transition Commission interim report recommended development of a climate emergency skills action plan and recognises this commitment in the programme for government. It states, we expect to see the assessment of workforces most likely to be affected by the transition, including those indirectly affected through the supply chains, and the most immediate and pressing skills needed. It also invites the Scottish Government to work with it over the year ahead to help inform its developments. This is surely also a precious opportunity to turn the focus on how to support women into STEM courses as the Skills Action Plan is developed. But how can the necessary opportunities for skills for a new Green Deal be developed across all sectors of the economy, both strategically and at the institutional level, with successive cuts to our colleges and universities, as laid out by Ian Gray in his Stage 1 budget speech? There are strategic challenges across all sectors to face for decades to come, and all spending decisions must be climate-proofed from here on out. Moving beyond this budget, we must also ensure that the updated climate change plan is robust and transformative. And profoundly important is that the reviews of the climate assessment of future budgets must deliver effective recommendations for action leading to transparency and accessibility to assess our way forward together. The SNP government must also do better to tackle the nature emergency, which is so intrinsically linked to the climate crisis. Nature solutions are real. We hear warm words from the government about how it values nature, but the facts do not hold this out. Since the SNP assumed office in 2007, Scottish natural heritage has faced a real terms cumulative loss worth as much as £302 million. And inevitably, there are cuts where there is a serious impact here. We all know that 11% of the species found in Scotland are threatened with extinction, and the Scottish Government is only on track to meet 7 out of 20 of the HE biodiversity targets. And there have been radical reductions in site inspections, meaning one of SNH's responsibilities, monitoring of wildlife and habitats, has been jeopardised. And the same of SEPA. In real terms, a cumulative cutback in its budget worth more than 38 million since the SNP came to power. Both these public bodies play a crucial role in maintaining and enhancing the health of our environment, sustainability of industry and living standards of communities, and the Scottish Government should be investing here. These are questions of quality of life rooted in the just transition principles all across sectors that are fundamental to the international and historic labour movement and to Scotland's future. Thank you.
Colin Beattie, followed by Graham Simpson.
Presiding Officer, I am grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this debate on the Scottish Government's budget proposals for 2020-21. And I am very conscious that the Scottish budget has been prepared against the backdrop of chaos and uncertainty in Westminster. We are in quite an unprecedented situation in which we are actually uncertain as to how much of our tax money will be returned from London to fund vital services in Scotland. The easy option would have been for the Scottish Government to put forward a standstill budget, which would simply replicate that of the previous year, pending information on what Scotland's handout might be. And it's to the Scottish Government's credit it did not do so. Instead, it chose to move forward in key areas which the people of this country value and support. And the budget's included a record £15 billion investment in healthcare and care services, which will also deliver an essential child poverty payment and expand early learning support and childcare by £645 million. This Government pledged to deliver 50,000 new homes in this Parliament and is investing £800 million in this budget to do so. And additionally, the Government is committing a further £300 million to ensure the momentum is maintained when the target is reached. There is nothing more important than providing a family with a home and a roof over their head. It is a fundamental right. The first £220 million has also been committed to the Scottish National Investment Bank, and this is a real opportunity to provide our burgeoning young companies with patient capital, which is so lacking in the present market. And in my experience as an MSP, mental health is a significant issue in my constituency, which I have to deal with. The investment of £117 million in mental health for all ages and stages of life represents a significant step forward, and I hope to see that investment spent wisely. I'm pleased with all the investment and progressive steps forward this government is taking, and that income tax levels have been held so that no one's paying more this year than last year. And it's really important to note that more than half of Scottish taxpayers continue to pay less than they would south of the border. Our tax system in general is a fair and progressive one, which is probably the fairest in the UK. And all this investment and solid commitment to progress is in spite of the brutal Tory policy of austerity. After 10 years, the evidence of its failure is indisputable. Indeed, Scotland's discretionary resource budget has been cut in real terms by £840 million over the past decade. And the SNP government has repeatedly called for an end to the austerity programme and been ignored. And while there are some fine words in London about ending austerity, the reality is that austerity lives on, and there is no indication that in its bottom line the UK budget will signal an end to this state of affairs. Now, before I continue with the Scottish budget proposals, let me make a small plea for my constituency. As part of the arrangement with the Green Party, there is a proposal to review the current initiative for Sheriff Hall roundabout. The City deal means that there are plans in place to upgrade the roundabout in order to help business and residents cope with the volumes of traffic. And the Green Party have asked for a review of these upgrades, which will delay the process. This review is not in the interests of my constituents, and the considerable reaction from my constituents to this particular proposal has been overwhelmingly negative.
Alison Johnson.
Aware that on the day the proposed roundabout opens, congestion will be 5% worse than it currently is. Does the member think that really is a good spend of £120 million, which could make a transformative difference and actually address the gridlock, the pollution and the congestion that blights our communities?
Colin Beattie.
I can't agree with your assessment on that, and perhaps if I can continue here, I'll be able to explain a few of the points. Very well.
Christine Graham. Do you have your card?
I
Ms.
do
Graham?
indeed.
Thank
you. I certainly have. I share the concerns of my colleague. I represent the other part of Midlothian. What I think my colleague and I would say to the Greens is that the changes that would have been at the Sheriff Hall roundabout would be useful to the buses because we have no trains in that part. And separately, there were walking and cycling facilities which they've now got rid of.
Colin Beattie.
Well, I can only agree with my colleague Christine Graham on that point. Clearly, the benefits of putting in place a solution to this long-standing choke point on the Edinburgh City bypass are multiple, and I'll list one or two of them. First one is safe cycling, and pedestrian routes will be put in place for the first time. It's an excellent first step in making this route greener and more sustainable. Many of my constituents have been waiting for these routes so that they have alternative ways of travelling safely. By delaying these upgrades, it prevents access to greener means of travel. Secondly, instead of a significant traffic build-up at the Sheriff Hall roundabout, traffic will instead be distributed to a variety of points which will produce marginal traffic build-ups as opposed to the significant traffic jam which currently exists. And this will minimise idling traffic and longer car journeys as a result of delays.
Mr Beattie is
I think I need to progress on this. The traffic jams from the inadequate traffic flow system means that vehicles are often idling and producing high emissions and pollution. And this is to the detriment of the surrounding villages and my constituents. These emissions could be lowered through better traffic flow and the upgrades that would enable this. And lastly, it makes every economic sense to have an efficient transport system in order to encourage businesses to move to the area or to remain in the area. Efficient transport links reduce pollution and sustain jobs. Public transports and cyclists alike depend on them. And I would ask the Scottish Government and the Green Party to reconsider this potentially damaging and deeply unpopular view. Presiding Officer, that was my small moment of dissonance in an otherwise unequivocal support for what I consider to be an excellent budget, and which I extend my congratulations to the Cabinet Secretary for constructing. In recognising the benefits of the Scottish budget, I also feel a sense of frustration when I consider what we are not able to do because the powers are not currently within our grasp. It's been made abundantly clear that Westminster is not going to reinvigorate Scotland. Only we ourselves can do that. With limited powers but huge ambition,
now,
we are achieving much more than anyone could expect. Presiding Officer, I urge support for this budget.
I call Graham Simpson to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, this really is a strange one, isn't it? We're debating the budget again, and nothing has really changed since last week. Our very reasonable demands have still not been entirely met. The Greens have been conned, or maybe they just rolled over like they always do. The wee Nats doing the big Nats bidding. Local government has been hit, as always. Council tax bills are going up and services will be poorer, jobs will be lost. The grass won't get cut. Christmas has been cancelled in North Lanarkshire. And music tuition is being pared back, and that's not good for the culture of Scotland. Nothing has changed since last week. Now, earlier today, I asked the First Minister how she responded to Citizens Advice Scotland's statement that council tax arrears are now their #1 debt issue. She spoke some words but didn't really give an answer. Now, when I spoke in the debate last week, I said we've seen council tax rise year after year, and I suggested we'd see council tax poverty if we hadn't already, and it seems I was right. The Citizens Advice Bureau network in Scotland is seeing more and more people struggling to pay council tax due to general pressures on household budgets. And last year, they helped over 2,000 people with council tax debts totalling nearly £7 million. That works out at around £3,000 a person. Somebody wants in? Yeah.
Andy Whiteman.
Intervention. Does Mr Simpson agree with me that the council tax is a regressive tax and therefore the debt problems that he cites will always be exacerbated by this simple fact? And does he agree with me as well that the Conservatives have brought forward no proposals for scrapping the council tax and seem to want to maintain the regressive council tax?
Graham Simpson.
Yeah, we've never argued that the council tax should be scrapped. And the point I'm making is the issue here is the level of council tax increases year after year after year is hitting people in the pocket. Now, yeah, there's lots of reasons for this council tax poverty, but it just can't have helped that council tax has rocketed by 21% in the course of this Parliament. And why is that? Because this government has been starving councils of funds, forcing them to increase bills while making cuts to services at the same time. This budget is no different. Council tax poverty is serious. Falling behind on council tax can lead to the removal of the right to pay in instalments, being charged the whole council tax bill for the year, and ultimately enforcement action to recover the debt by sheriff officers. And it's striking that around 88% of debt enforcement actions by sheriff officers are to recover summary warrants for council tax. When you cut funding to councils, this is what happens. Now, Citizens Advice Scotland also raised concerns this week about the fall in the number of claims for council tax reduction. And since 2013, when this scheme was introduced to replace council tax benefit, around 85,000 fewer homes have applied for this reduction, and figures for the last quarter released this week continue to show a fall. Citizens Advice Scotland believe this fall to be due to a lack of awareness among people, combined with the fact that council tax reduction requires people to make a claim, whereas claiming the previous council tax benefit was joined up with other benefits. And of course, I asked the First Minister, not at this moment, I did ask the First Minister if she would join with Citizens Advice to promote the scheme, and she didn't answer that either. Now, another of our reasonable asks was around homelessness. The draft budget makes £50 million available for the Ending Homelessness Together Fund, but as the Salvation Army pointed out last week, Scottish councils have submitted proposals for spending on homelessness for £130 million. We asked for a rather modest £10 million extra. Modest, but the Cabinet Secretary has sadly not gone for it. Spending on homelessness ultimately saves the public purse. No doubt that's why we had a protest at FMQs earlier. Spending on energy efficiency comes into the same category. The draft Scottish budget included a small increase of £18 million, up to a total of £137 million dedicated to energy efficiency measures such as the provision of insulation, new heating systems and advice and information for renters and homeowners. But this falls over £100 million short of what the existing Homes Alliance say is actually required, which will be a doubling of investment to £240 million. So the £25 million for investment in local energy efficiency projects announced last week is pretty small beer. Now, failing to invest properly in energy efficiency will drive up the cost of heat decarbonisation and risk undermining efforts to alleviate fuel poverty. At the current level of improvement, just 2% a year, according to the most recent Scottish House Condition Survey, it will take 25 years for the vast majority of our homes to reach a standard of EPC Band C. The draft budget misses a critical opportunity to capitalise on existing programmes to reduce fuel poverty and respond to the climate emergency before it's too late. The Greens can't possibly say this is good. Like much of this budget, it's a con.
John Mason, followed by Andy Whiteman.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to take part in another budget debate today. We covered quite a lot of ground in last week's Stage 1 debate, and some has been the same ground we've covered today. In between times, the Finance Committee had a fairly thorough session, I think, with the Cabinet Secretary yesterday. But there were a few issues I wanted to focus on particularly today. Firstly, I very much want to warmly welcome the free bus travel for under-19s. I had initially assumed it would be exactly the same as the scheme we currently have for those of us over 60, but it was good to hear yesterday from Kate Forbes that all options will be explored, and specifically that what young people themselves are wanting will be considered. And I imagine that discussion might include the ferries and Glasgow subway. Yes, okay.
Liam Kerr.
Intervention. I just wonder, does he think it inappropriate to spend £15 million on bus passes instead of £15 million on residential drug rehab beds?
John Mason.
Yes, well, I think as I hear one of my colleagues saying, the two are somewhat different and we're looking at two slightly different areas. I mean, I think one of my themes, if you listened to me last week, was that we would all like to spend more money on a whole range of areas. We would all, if we had the money, we would all like to spend more on health, local government, the police, and so on and so forth. The reality is we are having to choose priorities. And I think one of the things that disappoints me with the Conservatives, some of whom I know can add up, should be that they demand these more and more and more spending and will not tell us where that money is coming from. No, I really think I'd like to make a few points first. I might come back later. In the short term, the bus passes or the savings for young people will help both them and their families save money and allow them to travel more, or perhaps allow them to travel at all when they couldn't have afforded to before. However, I think one of my hopes from this is that in the longer term it gets young people into the habit of using public transport. And that can only be a good thing as we seek to reverse the decline in bus usage, especially in Glasgow and the west of Scotland. Secondly, I would particularly welcome the £3.4 billion in social security assistance. The Scottish Child Payment is due to start by December and could help 170,000 children under age 6 and eventually 410,000 children in all, lifting some 30,000 out of poverty. The Glasgow Centre for Population Health reckons that about one-third of children, or 37,000 in Glasgow, live in poverty, rising to 41% in some neighbourhoods. So measures like this are extremely welcome. Next, I was very impressed by Bruce Crawford's speech last week. His speech today was okay as well. And on especially focusing on the need for reserves. Now, that did form part of the Finance Committee's budget report. However, Mr Crawford really made a major emphasis of it, and I would have to say rightly so. As I understand it, our councils have a target for reserves of about 2%, although some may currently be below that. For example, I understand Glasgow has about 1.6% at the moment. So given our budget of £40 billion, 2% would be about £800 million in reserves. In one sense, that is not a huge figure, given the risks we face. On the other hand, if we had £800 million in reserves, when health, police, local government are all needing money, some people would feel that it was too much, as we could be spending that money on vital services. But it is a debate we need to have, and ideally we would have cross-party agreement on the principle of holding reserves and at least rough agreement on the figures required. Another point that came up in last week's debate was preventative spend. I think this was mentioned by Sarah Boyack and was again mentioned yesterday at Finance Committee by Alec Rowley in relation to the Christie Commission recommendations. Now, if I'm not mistaken, all parties agree on the principle of preventative spending, that is, that we spend earlier in any process in order to prevent bad things happening later on, be that young children growing up into ill health or young adults ending up in prison. If we were in a time of growing budgets, we would use the extra money to invest in new preventative spend while still carrying on with reactive spending for a period. However, the problem in a time of tight budgets, as we are now in, is that we would need to cut reactive spending first, i.e. disinvest, in order to finance more preventative spending. That could mean things like cutting new prisons in order to keep young people out of trouble, or cutting hospital budgets to put more into primary care. This is a debate we certainly should be having, but I fear opposition parties would be quick to criticise if reactive spending was cut and short-term problems arose. Another issue which appeared in the committee report and which the government has responded to this week is European Union funding. Now, EU funding may not be part of the Scottish budget per se, but it has been a vital part of our overall spending as a nation, both revenue and capital nature, and affecting both the public, private and third sectors. Specific mention in the committee report was made of the Common Agricultural Policy, structural fund support, common fisheries policy funding, research and innovation funding, as well as loans from the European Investment Bank. These are crucial issues and have been discussed, certainly to my knowledge, in the Economy Committee when I was there, Finance Committee presently, Rural Economy Committee as well, not to mention the cross-party group on industrial communities, which Colin Beattie ably chairs. The Cabinet Secretary made it clear yesterday at committee that we are making very slow progress, if any, on this topic, and she was hoping that there will be clarity in the Westminster budget next Wednesday, and I certainly hope there is. Our farmers, older industrial communities and many others really need to know as soon as possible whether, how and how much replacement funding there is to be. But whatever happens, we have to live within our means. There are always going to be areas we'd like to spend more money on, but we are a democracy and can only raise the amount of tax that people are willing to pay. In turn, that limits what we can spend, and allocating that money between needs is never going to be easy. But I think we have a reasonable budget here before us today, and I hope all parties will support it. Thank you.
The last of the open debate contributions is up to 3 minutes by Andy Whiteman.
Convener. Parties have this year, as previous, a choice to be made to develop proposals, to cost them, to negotiate and come away with some wins. Now, I don't know how much effort was made by each of the opposition parties, but before they criticise us, they could perhaps review their own approach, because it doesn't appear to be leading anywhere. Now, opposing this budget means reverting to last year's budgets, and Greens do not find that acceptable. And that's why I find the Conservatives' approach disappointing. Liam Kerr's contribution, like many of his colleagues, was out of tune with the challenges well set out by Alex Neil. It was also disappointing to hear Colin Beattie rehearse long outdated ideas of what road improvements actually achieve. Congestion, he talked about, will be increased by the proposed Sheriff Hall works by 5%. Congestion is tackled by taking vehicles off the road, which is why free public transport is so important. So Greens are pleased to have achieved a budget deal, reversing many cuts proposed by councils, securing concessionary travel for young people and investment in public transport. And in a parliament where no one party has a majority, a coalition has to be built to secure that support. Happy to do so briefly.
Neil Finlay.
Contributions so far. The argument has been made that if Labour votes against the budget, we're voting against all the budget and all the good things in the budget. If we take that a step forward, if Mr Whiteman votes for this budget, therefore he is voting for roads expansion and all the negativity that comes from that.
Andy Whiteman.
Are always finally judged, and I accept the fact that voting for a budget en bloc doesn't mean to support you anything, and voting against it doesn't mean you don't support anything either. But the point I'm trying to make is this is a parliament of minorities, and we have responsibilities to try and achieve a budget that has got broad support. We have done that, I think. We have filled the 95 million hole identified by COSLA and are continuing to implement the longer-term measures to improve local government finances agreed last year. And I sit on the cross-party talks that we secured with Willie Rennie and Rhoda Grant. And I genuinely hope
that if we make the requisite efforts in those talks, we will be able to reach agreement with the government on scrapping the council tax. But whether we do or not will be down to our own efforts. Parliament's now instigated a new approach to budget scrutiny, and that's very welcome. But as I mentioned last year, and as Kate Forbes mentioned in her opening remarks, we need a more strategic approach. And last year I suggested we might do better, that the Finance Secretary convened roundtable talks in September. Those talks could be followed by more detailed discussion and negotiation. Parties can then, building on that progress and trust, enter into detailed negotiations leading to the budget bill. And that might even involve parties submitting their own proposals to the Finance Committee. In other words, there are a lot of things we could do to make a Parliament composed of parties, as it is at the moment, work much better. But, Presiding Officer, no, this is not the budget a Green government would have delivered, but it is a better budget than was presented originally by the government, and we'll be pleased to support it tonight.
We move now to the closing speeches. Disappointing to note that not all members who took part in the debate are here, as they should be. And call James Kelly for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. So we're at the final stage of the budget. I've no doubt that Kate Forbes is glad to be nearing the finish line, having picked up the reins of the budget process in very difficult circumstances. I think Bruce Crawford made some interesting points around the budget process, and I think those should be taken seriously, and they should be taken seriously first of all by the government, who were criticised by the Fraser of Allender Institute for the transparency and the amount of information that they put in the public domain in order to facilitate budget discussions. I also think it's time that the government started to be a bit open about the process. You know, we heard when the budget was published how there wasn't any money left, all the coffers had been emptied, every penny had been spent, nothing left. And then Kate Forbes might be new to the job, but this has been gone through by various Cabinet Secretaries going back to John Swinney. Lo and behold, what happens is there's a change in the forecast. We've got some new assumptions. And hey presto, £173 million has been found down the back of the sofa. And then, as if in the Scottish Parliament's version of Groundhog Day, the Greens then suddenly appear and, oh, yeah, we'll now support the budget after all. So if we're really serious about a proper and transparent budget process, then, you know, when the budget is published, let's have all the money that's available and not sort of change it halfway through. Rhoda Grant and Claudia Beamish made some very strong points about cuts to council services. And I think the fact that in real terms there's been £898 million of cuts since 2013 and £205 million this year, you know, it shows you at the heart of this government is a policy of penalising local councils. And it's not just the figures. You just need to look at the analysis that the Herald done. Yes, I'll give way.
Tom Arthur.
I'm very grateful, and I ask this in all sincerity. He refers to 2013. Can he indicate what he would have seen cut instead of local government, as he puts it? What other budget lines would it have been? Would it be health? Would it be measures to go and mitigate Tory welfare reforms? What would it have been? What would Labour have done differently over the last 7 years?
James Kelly.
Well, see for a start, people like me and you should be paying more in tax, because as I was going on, to say, if you look at the Herald and Sunday analysis, what you're seeing there is you're seeing cuts to library services. Some councils are going to have to close libraries. Meanwhile, MSPs and government ministers will actually have pay less in income tax this year. That's totally unfair. That's not nonsense. That's not nonsense. Look at the spice analysis. And in addition to that, It's totally unfair. No, I won't take an intervention at this point. Read the Spice blog, Mr. Neil. As the Herald on Sunday also pointed out, support for children with additional needs is going to have to be cut at a number of councils, and that is totally unacceptable. So we face a situation where all across the country, local communities are going to have councils that are going to have to make cuts. And the question I would put to SNP MSPs is, when are you actually going to start standing up for the communities that you are sent here to represent? I mean, some of them, no thank you, no thank you. Some of them, I mean, some of the MSPs aren't even going to be standing for election next year, so you don't have to worry about re-selection. For once, discover a backbone and stand up for the constituents that you're sent here to represent. Labour will oppose this budget at 5 o'clock because of the inherent unfairness that is part of it. You've got a situation where if you're a government minister and you're in the Holyrood bubble, and you're in the Holyrood bubble and you're in your chauffeur-driven car, both Mr. Neil and Mr. Crawford have been there, and you find a situation where cumulatively over the year you won't be paying the same amount of income tax, and compare that with a single parent out in communities in Scotland who will be paying 4.84% more in council tax this year. And if you want to send your kid to a library, the services might be cut or it might be closed. And if you've got a kid that needs additional support, that's going to get cut as well. So there's an inherent unfairness at the core of this budget. And for that reason, Labour will oppose the budget at 5 o'clock.
Call Murdo Fraser for up to 7 minutes, please. 7 minutes.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, this is the third debate we've had in a week on the budget and related matters. So I think the Finance Secretary and opposition spokespeople need a stamina award for all the effort they've put in. And, you know, it's always a challenge at this stage to find new issues that have been raised. But I think there's been a number of points people have made that I want to try and sum up in the course of the next few minutes. And I think it's worth just at the start reiterating the backdrop to the budget. A 3.7% increase, real terms increase in the resource budget available to the Scottish Government, thanks to increases in spending at Westminster. This translates into around £1.6 billion extra in real hard cash that the Scottish Government has at its disposal. And yet, one of the consequences of the budget decisions taken by the Scottish Government, backed up by the Greens, as we know, is that we are still seeing real cuts to local council services across Scotland. And Graham Simpson made that point, and James Kelly has just made that point too. Just let me make this point. We only have to pick up local newspapers to see that councils across the country are having to reduce services, look at reducing teacher numbers, look, as Fife Council are doing, at potentially reducing the length of the school week, look at laying off school crossing patrollers, as Perthink and Ross Council are having to do, look at reducing the opening hours of libraries and leisure centres. That is the consequence of the deal that's been struck between the SNP and the Greens. And Mark Ruskell lives in a parallel universe if he does not recognise that's what is happening across Scotland. I'll give way to Mr Brown if he wants to intervene.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank Murdo Fraser for giving way? And he and a number of his colleagues have expressed concern about local authority budgets. Given that, will he condemn the huge increase in Public Works Loan Board borrowing applying to all councils because of what the UK Government believes is spendthrift spending by some English local authorities? It's an easy thing to do. Will he condemn it?
Murdo Fraser.
Mr Brown hasn't been listening. There's a £1.6 billion extra money coming to this Scottish Government that more than compensates for any increase in the Public Loan Board interest rate. Now, Presiding Officer, the Greens budget deal centrepiece was this supposed commitment to free bus travel for the under-19s. Now, we know it's no commitment at all. It's an allocation of just some £15 million towards an estimated annual cost of £80 million and will only be introduced in January next year, if possible. And we know there's been no consultation with the bus companies. There's been no consultation with local authorities. There's been no thought given to the impact on currently provided school transport funded by local authorities. Whether it will ever be delivered as a policy remains to be seen, but given the lack of any serious, rigorous work in preparation, it would be a reasonable bet that it never sees the light of day. Now, there's been a lot said in this debate, Presiding Officer, about the question of uncertainty due to the UK budget being in March, after the Scottish budget. And I would just gently remind members that there is nothing novel about this, because historically UK budgets always were delivered in March. It's only been for the last 2 years that there was a shift in the UK budget being moved to November. Indeed, the current fiscal framework, which was agreed by the Scottish Government, was negotiated and based on the assumption and on the basis that budgets would be in March. And of course, historically, the Scottish Governments would produce their budgets in September of the previous year. So I think we need to hear a little less faux outrage from the SNP benches about uncertainty caused by the timing of the budget, because historically that was always the case. Now, on the question of process, Presiding Officer, Donald Cameron and a number of members reminded us about this issue, which we raise in budget debates every year. Because when the Finance Secretary produced her budget on the 6th of February, she was very clear that all the money had been allocated. She told Parliament, and I quote, "In allocating these resources, we have used every fiscal lever that we have to the fullest extent. Every penny is accounted for." Now, as we pointed out at the time, this is familiar rhetoric. It is exactly the same language that was deployed by her predecessor as Finance Secretary. But over the years, he was able to find substantial extra funds down the back of the sofa. And true to form, the new Finance Secretary has pulled off exactly the same trick, producing £173 million from thin air in order to sweeten her deal with the Greens. Now, this point was made by Donald Cameron earlier, and it is a serious point, because it would substantially aid transparency and assist budget discussions if the full extent of resources available to the Finance Secretary were made clear at the time the budget was presented to Parliament. And of the additional sums found, £50 million has come from a reprofiling of non-domestic rates income over the period 2020 to 2023. In effect, what this means is that the Scottish Government is borrowing, although it doesn't like that term, but it is in effect borrowing against future income from business rates in order to increase its budget in this year. And given we are facing for next year an estimated black hole due to the overforecast of income tax receipts of some £555 million even before we start, I would question the prudence of dipping into income for future years at this point. Presumably, the Scottish Government is once again relying upon a Boris bailout to fill that gap, just as it has done in this year. I'll give way to Mr Crawford.
Bruce Crawford.
Murdo Fraser very much for giving way. In that case, I wonder, would Murdo Fraser explain to me why so many speakers from the Conservative benches, in speech after speech after speech, ask for additional spending upon additional spending, only contributing to adding to the risk to the Scottish budget in future years? The Tories have really lost their way on this one.
Murdo Fraser.
If Mr Crawford had been paying attention during all the budget debates we've had over the last week, and indeed over the last previous years, he would know if we could match Scottish economic growth, even to the UK average, we'd have billions of pounds extra to spend on Scottish public services, and we wouldn't have to increase taxation, and Mr Crawford should know that. Presiding Officer, the final point I want to make about the budget is that the entire fiscal position of Scotland is underpinned by the union dividend, a fiscal transfer now worth almost £2,000 for every man, woman and child in Scotland. And without that fiscal transfer, we'd see none of the additional spending being announced today. And without that support, Scotland's notional deficit stands at some £12 billion. And yesterday, the Minister for Public Finance, Mr Macpherson, let the cat out of the bag during the debate on the rate resolution when he confirmed that a loss of £12 billion from the Scottish budget would be, in his words, catastrophic. So there we have it, Presiding Officer, from a Minister in the SNP government. Independence for Scotland would be catastrophic to the public finances of Scotland and the public services enjoyed by the people of Scotland. I could not put it in better terms myself. And for that reason, Presiding Officer, and for all the reasons we have outlined, this budget should be rejected by Parliament this afternoon.
Now call Kate Forbes to wind up in this debate for up to 9 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary, to just before 5.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, this debate has once again allowed Parliament to reflect on the 2021 budget. I'm sure it will not be for the last time, not least because our decisions in this budget will have, in my opinion, a hugely positive benefit and make a difference to the people of our communities, because it sees an investment of around £645 million in the revolutionary expansion of early learning and childcare, improving the life chances of our children. It sees the £220 million of fresh seed funding for the Scottish National Investment Bank and its mission to drive the transition to a net zero economy. It sees an increased investment in health and care services by more than £1 billion to take total spend on the health service to £15 billion for the first time. It sees funding to establish the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, which, when fully rolled out in 2022, will help an estimated 30,000 children out of poverty. It sees £1.8 billion of investment in low-emission infrastructure, including a package of over £500 million of investment specifically designed to increase our efforts to respond to the global climate emergency. And all that sits alongside a progressive income tax system, with 56% of income taxpayers in Scotland paying less than if they lived elsewhere in the UK, whilst raising the revenue needed to support investment in the Scottish economy and our public services. Presiding Officer, voting against the budget tonight is to vote against all of it, to vote against over £1.4 billion towards tackling poverty, a cash increase of £589 million to local authorities and the £60 million uplift to the police. Most parties have stood up, indeed,
Liam Kerr.
Just very briefly, why won't the SNP government hand over the full £96 million in Barnett consequentials to the police?
Kate Forbes. Why won't the UK government hand over the VAT payments that they have not returned to the police service? Now, Presiding Officer, most parties have stood up today to criticise the budget for not spending vastly more sums of money on a particular area of their choosing, without the courage to identify what they would deprioritise in order to do that. And the truth of the matter is that despite the uncertainty, despite the risks of going before the UK government's budget, and despite the last decade of Tory-imposed austerity, we have set a balanced budget that prioritises investment in the economy, tackling climate change, reducing poverty and delivering certainty for taxpayers. We're doing that within a fiscal framework that will see the UK government claw back over £200 million this year and over double that next year because of forecast error, independently determined forecasts. But they're doing that, keeping one of our hands tied behind our backs, because borrowing powers for forecast error are limited to £300 million. That demonstrates why we need an urgent review of the fiscal framework to allow us to properly respond to the volatilities and the uncertainties we face. We've taken a prudent approach to this budget, and our assumptions are wisely made in order to deliver a balanced budget and give ratepayers and public services the certainties that we need. We've tried to spread the risk and spread our exposure to the UK government delivering on its promises made in the December election. Now, Murdo Fraser talked about the fact that we have gone before UK government budgets in the past, but the fiscal framework envisaged that block grant adjustments for the next financial year would be based on forecasts at the autumn statement before the Scottish Government budget in December. There has been no UK autumn statement which has been published this year, meaning that the Scottish budget has had to be based on provisional BGAs rather than on new, up-to-date OBR forecasts. That inevitably increases uncertainty around the Scottish budget. Now, if the whole chamber is agreed on how important the budget is, then surely we can all be equally amazed and astounded that the only assurances that the UK government could give the Scottish Government on the block grant was to refer us to estimates from March 2019, a year ago, and to an election manifesto. The consequences of the UK Government not delivering on its promises could have serious repercussions, and we will be holding the Tory Government to account for the promises that they made. Presiding Officer, Labour's position on the budget is somewhat wearying. They called for a climate change budget. We've delivered, but they still moan. They talk about inequality, and we invest £1.4 billion in tackling poverty, including the first child payments later this year. But I didn't hear a single comment from Rhoda Grant on that. They called for an extension of free bus travel to young people, but when it's delivered, it's never good enough. If the Labour Party votes against the budget tonight at 5 p.m, they are voting against £15 million to extend free bus travel. They are voting against £21 million for the Scottish Child payments, and they are voting against continued investment from the Scottish Child Poverty Fund and increases in the Scottish Welfare Fund. They cannot claim to champion the many, not the few, whilst voting against those increases. Presiding Officer, this year, through negotiations, the Greens have actually delivered something. They've actually made changes, they've actually left a mark and left a legacy. And I know that all the parents who've been in touch with me in the last week to talk about the difference that extending free bus travel will make to them and their families appreciate that. As for the Lib Dems, Willie Rennie talked about certain inevitabilities. What does appear inevitable is that the Lib Dems never achieve any of their asks because they set up absurd constitutional red lines. Bruce Crawford talked about the importance of being open and honest, about the risks that are inherent. Yes.
Patrick Harvey.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and I'm sorry to have to correct her, because the one time the budget fell, the Liberal Democrats achieved the astonishing consequence of voting for exactly the same budget without a single amendment in exchange for 2 letters written by the Scottish Government. That was their budget price, 2 postage stamps. Wasn't that impressive?
That is hugely impressive, and I'm glad I allowed for that intervention. Now, Bruce Crawford talked about the importance of being honest and upfront about the risks that are inherent in the fiscal framework and to make prudent judgments about tackling those economic challenges. Now, it's one thing for opposition parties to call for greater spending. That is easy. But the real test is how they take responsibility for the economic challenges we faced. Now, I enjoyed listening to a number of other speakers who made excellent points, including Alex Neil and John Mason. But, Presiding Officer, I am proud to present this budget tonight, which delivers for our communities and for our businesses, despite the uncertainties about our own block grant and still as we are contending with a decade of Tory austerity. Murdo Fraser talked about exactly how much he thinks is coming to the Scottish Government next week from the UK Government. We will hold the Tories to account for that. We will hold them to their promise of ending austerity and their election promise of levelling up spending. We will hold them to it because they have not just subjected the Scottish budget to unacceptable levels of uncertainty, they've actually subjected all of our public services, taxpayers and businesses to that uncertainty. But despite that, we've provided certainty. We've ensured that this is a budget that delivers for all of Scotland. It ensures that we're tackling climate change and tackling poverty. And I'm proud to commend this budget to the Parliament.
Thank you very much. That concludes our Stage 3 debate on the Budget Scotland No. 4 bill. We're going to move on now to the next item of business. The next item is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 21136 on a committee substitution. Could I invite Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions today. The first question is that motion 21113 in the name of Kate Forbes on the Budget Scotland No. 4 bill at Stage 3 be agreed, and members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 2113 in the name of Kate Forbes is yes 63, no 55. There were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Scottish Budget Bill is passed. And the final question today is that motion 2113-836 in the name of Graham Day on committee substitution be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. Thank you very much, and I close this meeting.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon as our First Minister has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a balanced stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.